Hello internet, and today's video is going to be my July wrap-up. And I know it's almost the end of August and I'm telling you what books I read in July, but I promise you this is actually going to be really short because July was the worst month for reading for me. In the middle of July, it kind of sums up to the reason why I haven't had a lot of videos. I overworked. I worked crazy hours so much that I was just exhausted and really didn't have time to do much other than sleep, read a little bit, and go to work. So I really didn't get a chance to edit or film, or at least the time I did have, I'd rather have spent reading or sleeping. So here we are in this position with me creating a wrap-up at the end of August, but that was for July. And July was, again, not a really good reading month for me, at least on my standards. If you guys have been keeping track of my reading, as I have with these wrap-ups, and have been watching them consistently, or just even a little bit, you would know that my average reading for this year of 2018 has been at least 20 books a month. A little more, a little less. It's always around the 20 mark. I always average around 20. For the month of July, I think I only read 10. I'm going to put the stats at the side. I'm not quite sure what exactly they are, but I'm pretty sure it was only 10 books. So only half as much as I usually read. I just had a lot of struggle trying to read this month. Not because I didn't want to read, just every book I happened to pick up wasn't really what I was going for. So I ended up just reading whatever I could actually get myself to read. I don't think it was so much a reading slump because I really desperately want to read and it's something I consistently do all the time. However, none of the books I was interested in were ones that I could read because I was trying to save those for the Nudes Readathon in August, and I am very much a mood reader, so I wasn't in the mood for all the 100 books I had left that weren't a part of my Nudes TBR. So that's how we kind of got stuck here. But that doesn't mean I didn't read a lot of books that I really liked in the month of July. So let's talk about them. As for the physical books I read, the first book I read was Emergency Contact by Marie S.K. Choi. And this book is about a girl who goes off to college. She ends up becoming friends with this boy that works at a cafe, and they end up joking and sort of becoming each other's emergency contacts because our main character Penny, one of our main characters, Penny, this girl Penny, sees our other main character, this boy Sam, go through a panic attack and helps him out, and they end up joking that they're going to become each other's emergency contacts, and they really foster this relationship through text messaging and just really learning more about each other and really being there for each other. It is a romance story. It does deal with things that may trigger you, like bad family issues, assault, violence sometimes, nothing like really in detailed, but it does touch on a lot of this stuff because both have their own personal issues for how they've grown up and kind of what made each other want an emergency contact in the first place. This book ended up really surprising me. I gave it a 5-star. I bought it on a whim because I was like, why not? And I ended up absolutely loving it. I think I read it in like a day and a half. It was really good in my opinion. Plus this color, I like this color of pink. I think it's a really nice color. Next, I read Frog Kisser by Garth Nix, which is kind of like a parody on the Princess Kisses a Frog motif that we see a lot. So this is about a young princess. She's around 13, and her stepfather, it's a weird story, is a very evil magician, and so she decides that she kind of has to go on this mission to try to stop her stepfather from abusing his power. And along the way, she promises to kiss transformed people, a lot of them who are frogs, if they swear to help her in her mission to defeat her stepfather, who is a duke. So it's really this weird fantasy story. I think it was really easygoing. It was really sweet. There was nothing too complicated about it. I don't think it was my favorite story. I think it is a good story, and it definitely is nice to see a strong female character who is feminine. I think Garth Nix does that a good job of making a female character who is feminine and intelligent and having her be a heroine and showing like another side, because I think like in recent years, with everyone trying to say females are awesome, which we are, it's always like so much like, oh, badassery, and like females acting masculine so to be seen as cool, and that in itself isn't a bad thing. It's just that we need to have other female heroines as well who are not masculine in nature and also see them succeed. So I did like this. It was a pretty average book. I thought it was good. If you like middle grade fantasies that are pretty easy, then you're probably going to like this book. It was fairly enjoyable. The next book that I read in physical copy was The Last Kids on Earth by Max Brailer and illustrated by Douglas Holgate. This was something I picked up on a whim. I have seen this book around a lot. I assume it's a really popular middle grade book because I've seen it everywhere, and this was actually for like at my used bookstore finally for like less than $5, because every other time I see it, even at the used bookstore, all the books in this series are selling for full price, so I can only assume it's really popular. And this is about a bunch of kids who have to survive the zombie apocalypse. They're at school, the zombie apocalypse breaks out, and now they're trying to survive. So it's about this boy and his friends and them just trying to survive while zombies are around, while other mutacious creatures are around, and like fighting them. I think it's really short. I think the writing style, the ease in which you can read it, is something reminiscent of A Diary of a Wimpy Kid. It's a very, very easy read. The illustrations are like, there's a lot of illustrations. I think if you have a kid who's like really into zombies, or a kid who's not, or like a kid who's not like a fan of reading but you want to try, this is a very good book. It was really entertaining. I liked it. I thought it was fun. So yeah, it's really short, it's really easy, it's a lot of fun, and if you want like a fun zombie book, then I suggest you read this. There's nothing horror, but there's a lot of like sneaky horror, like how in kids books there's things that are implied to be really dangerous and really creepy and like really horrible, but because it's a kid book, it's kind of played down as if it wouldn't be. And honestly, if I was in this kid's position, I would have died a lot faster. Like, he is way more badass than I am. I would have died straight off, no shame. That would be me. So the next books I read, I'm going to talk about the ebooks I read. I actually bought a copy of this one, but I read The Wild Robot by Peter Brown, and this was another book that really surprised me. I got it on ebook because I was like, huh, why not? Oh my gosh, this is such a sweet story. It's so precious. It is so precious. Oh, it just brings so much joy to my heart. So this one does have illustrations as well. Wild Robot takes place in like a futuristic society where robots are popular, and they have like AI sort of adjustments or whatever. They're really high tech, and there's a shipment of robots on the Roz line that are like on a barge across the sea, and then the barge ends up getting in a storm. A lot of the cargo falls off, and a lot of the cargo was these robots that end up washing up on this island. However, all of the robots get destroyed except one robot that's like Roz and then some number, but we're just gonna call her Roz for the sake of this. So Roz ends up washed up on shore, and she ends up getting turned on by a otter that was kind of curious, and the whole book is about Roz living on this island, walking around this island, and because of how intelligent her programming is, she ends up learning how to speak to animals by listening to them and stuff like that. And so she ends up becoming a part of this island community of animals, and then she gets this little goose son, and she raises her goose son, and it's really, really sweet. And it's just about a mom robot and her goose son and her living in the wild and being a wild robot. And then the second book book, which was The Wild Robot Escapes, which I also read, just continues on that story about this wild robot and her just figuring out that she's really different because of the environment she grew up in compared to other robots. Her programming gave her other benefits, like she now has the ability to talk to animals because she bothered to learn. Anyway, it's really sweet. I highly suggest it if you want a sweet robot story. It was just the cutest. It was the cutest, and I highly recommend this book. Next was a short story that I read, which kind of goes back to one of my favorite authors, which is Sarah Reese Brennan. One of my favorite books, which is by Sarah Reese Brennan. It's In the Other Lands, which I did reread this month. I'll talk about more in that in a second. But on ebook, I ended up borrowing the anthology in which Sarah Reese Brennan had put in a short story that started off the progress to create the book In Other Lands, which is called Wings in the Morning, which is told from Luke Sanborn's perspective, and all of that. So I read that because I was really curious, because In Other Lands is my absolute favorite book. I love that book so much. So I wanted to read the short story that came out that kind of introduced it, and I wanted to read from Luke Sanborn's perspective. And since we're on that, I guess we might as well move to what I read on audiobook. And one of the audiobooks I read was In Other Lands, because again, July was just not a great month. And yes, I did read this book in June. I reread it in July, and I loved it even more the second time. It was so good. So I highly suggest this. If you guys don't know what this book is about, it is about a young boy called Elliot. At the age of 13, he gets told that there is another world that is on the other side of this magical wall. In this world, there are mermaids and harpies and elves and dwarves, and he is being accepted into this border camp, which is a school that trains you to be a part of basically the Borderlands police system and warriors. And Elliot ends up making friends, and he's a little sass master, and he's kind of an asshole, like, no lie, and I really relate to him, and I love him, and he's my favorite character. And there's so much about this book that it's great. Elliot is a bisexual main character who has relationships with both males and females explicitly, and it talks about that, and it's just nice to see bi rep in that way. It was nice for Elliot just to be such an asshole all the time, because, like, again, I relate very deeply. And just, I liked everything about this book, so I reread it on audiobook, and I was gonna reread it again in August, but I was like, no, gotta give chance to new books to enter into your life. This is just one of those books that I highly recommend to everyone. It's just not enough good things I could say about it. It's the best. It is the best, and I am thankful every day that I just picked up this book and read it, because it is so good. Next, I read My Plain Jane. Ooh, okay. Something fell up there, and it freaked me out for a second. I thought it was gonna fall on my head. It did not. So I read My Plain Jane, which is by Cynthia Hand, Brody Ashton, and Jody Meadows. This is a part of their My Lady Janie series. The first book in that series was My Lady Jane. My Plain Jane is the retelling of Jane Eyre. I think if you really love Jane Eyre, you might not like this book as much, because I feel like Jane Eyre is a Victorian romance. Out of all the classics, it is technically a romance. Wuthering Heights, not so much, but Jane Eyre, you can make that argument. And here, Jane Eyre is a character, however, her romance isn't a big part. We do get a romance in this book, but it is not Jane Eyre's romance. It's Charlotte Bronte's romance. So I liked this book. I thought it was good. This is about Jane. She can see ghosts. It's a part of a society where you can see ghosts. It follows along a lot of the beats of Jane Eyre, as it is a retelling. It has some great British humor that I really like. I think the only downside to it was, again, if you were going into it expecting to see a Jane Rochester romance or any sort of tie-in there, you're going to be sorely disappointed. While personally I was never really a huge fan of Jane Eyre, I read it. It wasn't the worst classic I've read. I got problems with classics, but that one was fairly decent. I was expecting there to be some sort of twist, something going on, and you seeing Jane have her own romance. Here, the romance doesn't come until sort of the very end, and I think that this book is maybe a 3.5 stars. However, I am going to mention I did bump this up to a 4 stars after buying the Target edition, which does have a bonus chapter that goes more into Jane's romance, that gives you a little bit more of that, of what you expect out of the whole Jane Eyre story, which is Jane and Rochester. So there is a bonus chapter in this edition that I have, which came from Target, and I think when you count the bonus chapter along with the rest of the story, it really does fill in that hole that was taken away with the plot and everything that went on with the Jane Eyre Rochester thing, that you do get your Jane and Rochester moment. So it sounded really confusing. I thought it was a good book. I thought it was funny. I thought it was great. The only downfall to it is that I kind of expected, and I think a lot of people do, if they're familiar with the subject material, to expect more of a Jane Rochester moment. In this book, there's a lot less of that. However, it is made up for if you get the copy with the bonus chapter. The bonus chapter makes up for the lacking of Jane having a romance. However, there is a good one with Charlotte, so if you are still hoping for a sort of Victorian-ish romance, you're still going to get it. So I did like this book. I definitely highly recommend getting a copy that has the bonus chapter, or at least finding out how to read the bonus chapter if you choose to read this book as well, because that really does add a lot to the story, which kind of gets me in a whole thing of, should they be a bonus chapter if it does improve upon your story, because shouldn't it just be in every book sold instead of being an exclusive thing that only comes in some editions? But you know what? Whatever, just buy this book with the bonus chapter and you'll probably be a happier person. Next, I finally finished Ray Carson's trilogy about the Gold Seer, and that is Into the Bright Unknown, which is the third book. I got this on audiobook. I think this is fairly good. This is a Western series following a girl who is a gold witch. She's been going through a lot of issues with like trying to keep her gold powers under wraps, and now they have gone to San Francisco to confront a politician who is trying to rip them off, and so now they're playing this little game to try to figure out how to rip the politician off before he rips them off and like does some really bad stuff to them. I think this series is pretty solid. I think Ray Carson's whole Gold Seer series is a pretty solid series. However, I did not enjoy it as much as I could have. Even like going back and reading this, I did like it. I thought it was a good book. However, Westerns aren't usually my thing, so I didn't really enjoy this because already had a point against it being a Western. And then two, I thought it just sometimes took too long to get to where I wanted to go, but I wasn't sure where I wanted it to go. The point is I don't think this was a book written for me as it was written a Western, but I do think it is a pretty solid book and a pretty solid series. I do think that this series, out of like compared to her other series and compared to any other trilogy I've ever read by any other author, if you read the Gold Seer series, I think you could stop at any book. If you only read the first book, it works as a standalone. I think every book in the series kind of works as a standalone in itself. Like, you can read it as the first book as a standalone, you could read the series as a duology, or you could read it as a trilogy. Each book has its own story that's kind of a condensed in and of itself, that it really reads well, just each book by itself. So no matter where you stop in this trilogy, you never really feel like you're lacking anything, which I'm not quite sure is a good or a bad thing, just how I felt about this trilogy in general. This is the only series, the only trilogy I've ever read that I felt okay if I just stopped reading at that point or reading after that book, because it seemed like everything was wrapped up good enough that like there was no real burning question. There was like still a lot of like empty things and stuff to be tied together, but it worked as a standalone. So I don't know how else to explain that, but it worked good. And then the last book that I read on audiobook was Only Humans by Sylvain Neuvel. This was the last book in the whole Themis Files trilogy. I liked this book well enough. I don't think it's my favorite. It might be a little bit of an unpopular opinion, but I think the very first book was my favorite book. The second book was sort of okay, and this third book I liked. I think like this series is a whole good case study on how humans react to strange, unnatural things in our society, just humans in general, and now humans as a global population, and how we react when things unexpectedly happen to us. So I did think it was a pretty solid series. I liked it. I think if you're going to read it, you definitely have to read the audiobook, or at least read along to the audiobook, because every character has their own voice actor. It's all done in like case study files and stuff. It's really just like the superior Illuminae. Not like dishing on the Illuminae series or anything, but if you're familiar with the Illuminae series, then take this series as the Illuminae series, but more intensive, right? So that's kind of how the Themis Files feels, and I definitely recommend the audiobook. I can't really get into like what the third book was about and all of that sort of stuff, but out of all three of them, it was my least favorite, but that's probably because by the third book, all my favorite characters were gone. So, yeah, this is gonna be a strange clip to insert. So I realized while editing that I actually read one more book, and that was Beneath the Sugar Skies by Shannon McGuire, and I didn't talk about that book in this wrap-up. So I did read Beneath the Sugar Skies. It is the fourth book in the series that she wrote about like portal fantasies, and in this one we get to see the world that Suki came from, and we get to see her daughter. I did like this book. I think it's my favorite. I think all of the books in this kind of cater to a specific type of person who likes a specific type of portal fantasy, which I find really fitting, given that the whole thing is about a person finding a world that they can call their own home, and that there is a world out there for everyone, even if it isn't the world you're born in. So I like that each book has a different feel to it, and really like each person who reads the series, you're going to have a favorite given on what you particularly like. I think like each book that I read from this series, I like the next book even more than I did the last, because I love the whole idea of it. I did like this book. I thought it was a lot of fun. I think this book really gives you what you expect when you learn that there are tons of portals to tons of different worlds. So you actually get to visit a lot of worlds, and it is interesting to visit worlds that you have heard about before, rather so like you've heard about these worlds, like you get to visit Nancy's world, you get to visit Suki's world, you get little backstories about the other girls who have gone to other worlds. So while you don't like the characters that are in the story don't actually visit those worlds, you still get to see those worlds through their memories. So that was really cool, and overall I'm just excited for the next book, because you learn more about the goblin fairy world in this book that Kale, I think that's his name, he went to. And I'm pretty sure that the fifth book in the series, Absent Dream, I think it's the fifth book, yeah, the fifth book in the series, Absent Dream, is supposed to be it taking place in that world, because the synopsis says something about the goblin market, and I liked it. Like, I liked the whole idea. So, yeah, I did read one more book. It is, like, in the statistics. I just realized that editing, I never actually talked about my feelings or what that 11th book was. So, yeah. That's why you get this little kind of random clip right at the end that doesn't match anything else. And that is it. Those are all the books that I read in the month of July. As you can tell, it's not a lot. This probably is probably still gonna be long, but like I didn't really talk about much of anything. If the only takeaway you take is read In Other Lands by Sarah Breeze Brennan, that's what you should be taking away from this video, because obviously if I read it again the very next month after I first read it, then it's a good book. Other than that, comment down below. Actually, I want to ask you, what do you guys do when you're having sort of a mood where you really want to read but you're struggling to find any books you'd like to read? Because that wasn't my big problem in July. I don't want to call it a reading slump, because I don't know, it wasn't a reading slump, it was just me being really moody and really just not liking anything. But then again, I think all the books that I picked up were just not books for me at the same time. So what do you guys do when you are a mood reader but all of the books that you happen to own are none of the books that you're in the mood for? Like, what is your best advice for that? Should I just push through books to like maybe like hit against that? Do you reread some of your favorite books? Because like when I reread In Other Lands, I was 10 times happier. Like, I was just living in the joy of my life when I reread one of my favorite books. Like, what do you guys do when you're having like one of those moods where you really desperately want to read but all of the books you're picking up just have no interest to you because it turns out you bought those at the wrong time, like it turns out that they're not what you were expecting? Whatever the reason, what is your advice? If you like what you're seeing here and you want to continue to see more, click all those buttons down below, and goodbye, internet.